We're going to begin today's presentation, and kicking us off, not quite at the beginning, is Larry, who's going to talk about who does what at the NAIC. Larry.
Thank you, Paul. And if we could advance the slides to the beginning of that section. Thank you. I think this is going to be review for most of the people listening, but just to go through very quickly, one of the special things about the United States system of insurance regulation is that it's primarily state-based. And the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, better known as the NAIC, is the coordinating body in which the chief insurance regulators of all the states and the District of Columbia and the territories come together to set standards and support one another. And within the NAIC, there are a number of very high-level committees, one of which of special concern to us is the Financial Condition Committee, often called by its letter, the E Committee. And it has many subgroups, three of which we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. The key units within the NAIC that are addressing today's topic of insurance company investments are the ones that are shown in gold and in this chart, the family tree, if you will. And one of them is the Valuation of Securities Task Force, which reports directly to the E Committee. And then there are two working groups that report up to the E Committee through task forces, the Statutory Accounting Principles Working Group and the Risk-Based Capital Investment Risk and Evaluation Working Group. Next slide, please. So Statutory Accounting Principles, often called SAPWIG for short, is doing what its name implies. It develops and maintains the statutory accounting principles that govern financial reporting by insurance companies. And as I think, again, most of you know, but if not, insurance companies use a different accounting system from GAAP. It's called statutory accounting, or SAP, or STAT, and in general is much more conservative than GAAP accounting and focuses on the readiness of assets to be used to pay policyholder claims above all. The Valuation of Securities Task Force, sometimes called VOS or VOS-TF, is responsible for the credit assessment process for securities that insurance companies own as investments. And it oversees a number of groups, one of which is the Securities Valuation Office, or the SVO. And its Bible, if you will, is a manual called the Purposes and Procedures, or the P&P manual. And we'll be talking about that a little bit today too. Next slide, please. The Risk-Based Capital Investment Risk and Evaluation Working Group is the newest. The others have been around for a long time. This one was launched only in 2022, and its charge is to perform a comprehensive review of the C1 asset risk component of the risk-based capital RBC investment framework. And it is focused on the treatment of asset-backed securities, especially including CLOs, CFOs, and other securities that have tail risk. So that means looking at what are the methodologies for capturing the risk, whether the residual tranches need to be specially evaluated as the debt in comparison to the debt tranches, and a mandate really to have a concern about arbitrage incentives, which Paul will talk about a little bit later on. Next slide, please. We're ready to move to the nitty-gritty topic of SVO and the use of ratings. So that Paul is going to pick up with.
Thanks, Larry. Yes, again, much of this will be familiar to many of you, but filing exemption is fairly important to U.S. insurers. About 80% of all investments made by U.S. insurers are, in fact, filing exempt. The benefit of filing exemption is that the RBC charge will be determined by the translation of the NRSRO, or in NAIC parlance, the credit rating provider, or CRP's rating, without the need for any independent or other assessment by the SVO or anyone else at the NAIC. If you're not filing exempt, the requirement is that you must submit the investment to the SVO for its evaluation and assessment and the determination of an NAIC designation. So it's pretty important whether you have a security which is filing exempt or not. Over the last several years, we've seen a whittling back of filing exemption, and primarily that whittling back has been in response to perceived abuses or misuses of the CRP ratings, and particularly where there was a view that was taken and persuasive that the CRP rating was not adequately capturing the, quote, regulatory risk of an investment. Nobody's quite sure what the regulatory risk is, but it's certainly something other than the CRP credit rating. The first significant event was in January 2021 in response primarily, I would say, to the failure of the global bankers series of companies. That resulted in insurers being required to file PPS, or principal protected security investments, with the SVO for review. So filing exemption was withdrawn. And again, the default, of course, is that that means they have to be filed with the SVO for review. It would be, I think, an understatement to say that's a fairly awkward definition for that concept, but it includes things like CLO combo notes and some other transactions, which again, had previously been filing exempt and would not have gone through this process. The result has been relatively draconian to some types of securities, particularly CLO combo notes, which are really no longer done, in part because the fear is the SVO's determination would be much more conservative than the third-party rating that they would have otherwise applied. I should note, just for completeness, that in August 2022, there was an amendment made to the PPS definition to clarify that it did not need to include or involve an SPV or a repackaging, but was expansive enough to include notes that had a variable return tied to reference or particular assets. Relatedly, since again, January 2022, insurers that invest in securities that have private letter ratings have been required to file and provide to the SVO a copy of the related private letter rating rationale report. And the rating rationale report is expected to be similar to the public rating reports which credit rating providers routinely provide. Since that date, the SVO has been analyzing those private letter rating rationale reports and has been using the data that they're building to either decide or not that there are categories or of assets or investments where they would like to withdraw filing exemption and again trigger the requirement that the investments be submitted to the SVO for designation. Next slide, please. An important memorandum was delivered way back in December 2021. That memorandum was from senior staff of the Investment Analysis Office, expressing their concern about CRP ratings. And the memorandum included a staff review of a sample of privately rated securities, and it expressed the view that the NAIC designations that would have been equivalent differed substantially or significantly from the staff's own analysis. And they highlighted that in some cases, that difference would be 3 to 6 notches from the staff's estimate. And certainly expressing a concern that there seemed to be very poor correlation between credit rating providers and ratings for the same security. And they noted, of course, that the consequence under the RBC system is that if you're not accurately capturing that credit risk, your RBC is not going to adequately show capital for the related security and its investment risk. In speaking with others who've looked at that data, or that report rather, it's not quite clear what the sample was, so it's been hard to replicate. There's some skepticism about the fact that privately rated securities most often don't have 2 ratings, so you'd never see a split rating for most private rated securities. And again, nobody's been able to recreate these conclusions because the data was blind. But it was an important memorandum and certainly has set the stage for some of the matters that we're going to be talking about later today. Next slide, please. The review by the SVO of those private letter rating rationale reports prompted a proposal in December of 2022 to withdraw filing exemption for structured equity and fund investments. I'm not going to read the definition, you'll be pleased to hear. But again, this was a concept that they thought was emblematic of the category of assets or investments which weren't, the ratings which were being obtained for them were not capturing the regulatory risk that the SVO saw. This was a sweeping proposal. It would have included CFOs, rated feeders, potentially, and see a number of other investments. So it certainly attracted significant attention from industry and interested parties. Next slide, please. I think I've already said this, but again, the consequence of you not having filing exemption is you have to submit the investment to the SBO for its assessment. The SBO's proposal was motivated clearly by the private letter rating rationale reports, as I note, and again, concerns about regulatory arbitrage, where the view was that the CRP ratings were allowing insurers to get advantageous statutory accounting and RBC treatment. However, the proposal did elicit, as I mentioned, significant comments from industry and interested parties. It was widely viewed as an attempt to step back from the progress which was being made in the same period by the Statutory Accounting Practices Working Group on their bond project. And that had been moved to the point where it was looking like it was going to allow for bond treatment for the investments that would have been caught within the definition of structured equity and fund investments. So again, there was an inconsistency and a tension between the direction being taken in SAPWIG and the SBO proposal. Next slide, please. So in March, Valuation Securities Task Force asked the SBO staff to narrow the focus of the proposal to securities which carried a private letter rating, asked the SBO staff to develop criteria, which the SBO would then be required to use before they denied filing exemption on a case-by-case basis. And last, they wanted to see due process in the SBO procedures so that there was some confirmation of clarity that there was transparency, and this would have been an opportunity for an insurer to present its case and make a rebuttal. It was noted at the meeting that transparency goes two ways. The SBO obviously needs transparency into the securities, but equally insurers need transparency into the SBO process before filing exemption could be denied and effectively overriding the CRP rating. Next slide, please. So undaunted, the SBO comes back in April of this year and proposes amendments to the P&P manual, which would have granted the SBO a level of discretion over the filing exempt process and to have curbed what they called the NAIC's current blind reliance on credit ratings. The amendments would have established a process by which a state insurance regulator or the IAO staff could contest an NAIC designation that had been assigned as a result of filing exemption, where they thought that was not a reasonable assessment of risk of the security for regulatory purposes. Again, not a lot of transparency or clarity about what that actually means. And the trigger was where the difference had to be between 3 notches between the related CRP rating and the SBO's assessment. Next slide, please. This proposal was noticed and comments were received. As you might expect, it generated a significant amount of comments from industry and interested parties. Before getting into those, however, just a couple of things that should be highlighted. One, the SBO's proposal was not limited to private letter ratings, as had been directed by the Valuation of Securities Task Force. The sensible reason given by the staff was that were that to be a limit, it would have been too easy to evade this override process. And the SBO proposal did provide that the ultimate arbiter of an insurance company's appeal was unfortunately the SBO itself, which seemed to be at some dissonance with the notion of due process, since due process would normally indicate a neutral party or to be deciding appeals of the type that required by the procedures. Next slide, please. At its March meeting, the Valuation of Securities Task Force decided to expose the SBO's proposed amendments, a relatively short comment period of July 14. There were 12 comment letters submitted. All of them were critical, some harshly critical, and the comments included a letter from 8 members of the House of Representatives Financial Services Committee, to which, again, the NAIC has responded in its own strongly worded letter. We commend those comment letters to you. If you're interested, they were included in the materials for the August 14 meeting. Next slide, please. So what happens at the August 14 meeting? The chair of the Valuation of Securities Task Force in her introduction noted that there was no intention for the SVO to replace or compete with rating agencies, but the process was meant to be complementary and was really intended to allow the SVO to challenge rating agency ratings so that the regulators were responsible users of the CRP ratings. And where in regard to the comments which had called for a third party to adjudicate appeals, she certainly thought that that would not be cost effective. Some had suggested, I think it was ACLI had suggested that the appeal should come back to the Valuation of Securities Task Force. Her view was that was not cost effective, but she certainly thought it would be sensible to involve a third party that could be engaged to review the processes that the SVO would be using to do deeper due diligence on the CRP providers. Next slide, please. The SVO director, Charles Theriault, responded to comments. He noted that the 2021 memorandum had included this sampling of private rated securities, which did show significant notch differences. In regard to transparency, he noted that the SVO was in fact limited by confidentiality obligations when dealing with privately issued and privately rated, and that the SVO would only be able to publish high-level anonymized information, but it would be able to share more detailed information with the actual insurer that owned a related security. And generally regarding methodology, he offered that the SVO favored Moody's and S&P methodologies because they were clear, reasonable, and widely accepted. Next slide, please. Also speaking at the August meeting, the SVO Investment Counsel, Mark Wellman, addressed the comments as well. He noted that he thought some people saw NRSROs as if they had a seal of approval from the SEC. He disagreed with that view. And he in fact noted correctly that the Credit Rating Agency Reform Act prohibits the SEC from regulating ratings methodologies or procedures of rating agencies. His conclusion is that that meant it was up to consumers of credit ratings, in this case the NAIC, to evaluate the rating agencies and their methodologies of ratings. He said NRSRO ratings are not sacrosanct, but the SVO proposal is decided to fill the need for the NAIC as a consumer to decide whether or not to use NRSRO ratings, and when they are to be used, how they're to be used. And all of those comments really go to the concern that had been held by some that the proposal was an effort by the SVO to replace or compete with NRSROs. Next slide, please. The SVO director, Mr. Theriault, went on. In order for the SVO to initiate a challenge, he noted again there would be this 3-notch difference that would have to be shown. There's some skepticism among observers about that because it's not clear how the SVO would be making an assessment without complete information. But again, there is a requirement in the proposal that there be a 3-notch difference. He did state that the insurer that had an affected security would be notified that the security was under review. They would have an opportunity to provide data. They would certainly have a right to appeal. And obviously, if the appeal were to be denied, they would have the option either to file the security or obtain a different NRSRO rating. Other insurers that own the same security could be joined in the process. And obviously, the affected state regulators could also have a role. And he certainly compared the proposed SVO process to insurer processes and concluded that at least the SVO's view was that that would be reasonable and similar. Next slide, please. The SVO has in fact agreed to make some changes in a revised proposal. The SVO Director Theriault acknowledged there are a number of actionable recommendations. Those included that there would be a generic summary of every override action. There would be an annual report summarizing the override actions taken during the year. And as the chair of the Valuation of Securities had foreshadowed, that they would engage a independent third-party consultant to analyze the SVO's process for the review of the NAIC's executive committee. Next slide, please. So what do the interested parties say? They noted that the SBO was making a decision with incomplete information, and the prototypical case is a private letter rating rationale report, not actual documents. And they certainly expressed the view that the SBO, before making determinations like this, really should have looked at and been given the required additional documents, the private placement memorandum and legal documentation, before they took action that would potentially override the NRSO rating. They certainly noted that it's not just a single insurer that might be affected, that you need to contact and involve in this process all insurers who hold a particular security and their state regulators at the outset, so that there's full and frank participation in the process. And obviously they did make the point which had been made earlier, that for true due process, the appeal has to be decided by somebody other than the SBO. And they certainly expressed a general concern that clarity was required about how and when the SBO challenge and override decision could be limited to a particular security or might be applicable to a broader range of investments. Next slide, please. Additional comments were override decisions, including any uncertainty about override decisions, have significant potential to freeze the market for an asset. We've had history with that with trust preferred securities in 2008, as was noted by commenters. And certainly some insurers, in reaction to the proposal, had apparently established a moratorium on certain investments. Insurers, and they also noted that insurers who actually own securities that are being challenged are actually in sort of a box, because the fact of the challenge is material information potentially, and they would be unable to sell the security while in possession of that material non-public information. So there was a concern about that. Next slide, please. A regulator also spoke up and said the goal of the proposal obviously was to provide a mechanism or means for the SBO to allow industry to rely on SRO ratings where they're appropriate, to provide a relief valve was the term used, to allow that to be withdrawn where the determination is a particular CRP rating is not appropriate. Two regulators expressed the view that when the insurer appeals, the ultimate decision maker should be the relevant state regulator. So we'd be back at the state level for ultimate determination. And the reading then concluded with Chair Mears noting that the suggestions that have been made would all be reviewed in good faith. So the challenge now is for the SBO to prepare a revised proposal reflecting these comments and responding. Next slide, please. I just note, although I think Larry will be talking about this in more detail, there is no immediate impact of the E Committee's holistic review framework document on these actions. So as far as the Valuation of Securities Task Force is concerned, the SBO is off revising its proposal and will be coming back with a revised proposal, which, if it's significantly different, they may have to notice and allow comments on, or they would be taking action on. But again, nothing immediately happens. There's no pause or stay as a result of the framework, which has been tabled for consideration by the E Committee. That's a little disappointing to some, in particular because the framework document does include lots of discussion about NAIC designation and the role of the SBO, and also touches on the ongoing review of RBC factors for ABS. There had been an expectation, as I probably have inferred, that the valuation of securities might at least pause or consider the potential application of this framework. That did not happen, although it was briefly acknowledged by the chair of the Valuation of Securities Task Force at that meeting. Next slide, please. Okay, so what can we expect? Current indications are the SBO is going to revise its proposal. We'll be coming back to Valuation of Securities Task Force with a revised proposal reflecting or responding to comments. But it does appear that there seems to be a momentum for an override of NAIC designation from where derived from an NRSO rating to eventually be adopted by the Valuation of Securities Task Force in some form. that really leaves open questions only about checks and balances. So, when could the SVO make the determination? What information must they have? How quickly can they get to an insurer? How do they tell other insurers who hold the security? All those details really have to be figured out. And there's an important open question about where the appeals go. That really wasn't determined in any concrete way at the meeting. So the question becomes for the VOS TF members, how many of these checks and balances are they willing to include and which ones? We certainly saw powerful comment letters from trade associations, particularly ACLI, and we expect those on an ongoing basis to be continuing their engagement on these matters and to be quite influential in the ultimate outcome. Next slide, please. I think I'm turning this now to Larry to talk about the holistic framework review document that I mentioned.
Thank you, Paul. We are on the slide. So the Financial Condition Committee, the E Committee, met on August 15th. So the day after the Valuation of Securities Task Force met. And that is the typical sequence because all of the working groups meet and the task forces meet, and then it all rolls up to the parent committee, the E Committee. And typically the E Committee meeting most of the time is a very short meeting and consists of approving the actions that were taken by the various subgroups. And in this case, because the agenda included this newly released document, the framework for regulation of insurer investments, a holistic review, then there was a lot of expectation that that was relevant to the work of particularly the VOS task force and the RBC investment risk and evaluation working group, and that it might be taken into account. As Paul said, it didn't turn out quite that way, at least not at the Summer National Meeting. The document asks, what is the most effective use of regulatory resources in the modern environment of insurance regulation for investments? It recognizes that insurance companies are turning to more complex and asset-intensive investment strategies, and that this is not the same as investments looked in the last generation. And so the question is, how do the NAIC bodies that oversee the use of investments deal with some of those changes? Next slide, please. One of the things that was particularly, that I thought was particularly relevant was that this framework document, and the last slide had a link to it. I do urge, it's only 5 pages. It's worth everybody reading. One of the things that it dealt with was the use of ratings, NRSR ratings. And it sounded a call for focusing the SVO's role on due diligence of the NRSROs, as kind of in contrast to actually trying to second guess the NRSROs in overriding ratings of particular securities. It didn't come out and say, do this, not that, but it suggested that the resources would be well directed towards enabling the SVO to do more due diligence of the agencies rather than overriding of agency ratings. And that it was because of that some of us were hoping that the Valuation of Securities Task Force might slow things down a little bit and wrestle with that suggestion more deeply. As Paul explained, that didn't happen. The chair of the E Committee, Elizabeth Dwyer from Rhode Island, a very able and respected leader of that committee, did mention the holistic review document in the context of the work streams and said it was not going to stop the ongoing work of the RBC review for asset-backed securities, the valuation of securities, implementation of financial modeling for CLO investments, which Paul is going to speak about a bit, and the SVO proposal that Paul just discussed for rating overrides. To the extent that this holistic document is actually going to make a difference, my own prediction is that it may have the most to do with the RBC investment risk and evaluation working group, because that group is still in its relatively early stages as it is doing the comprehensive review of RBC for asset-backed securities. And one of the concepts that's quoted in this E-Committee document is an idea that one of the insurer groups has been championing very strongly, which is that there should be equal capital charge for equal risk, that there should be an attempt to level the way capital charges are set in a genuine risk-based form. So with that in mind, I think that I don't think I have a whole lot more to say about the holistic review document, and ready to pass it back to Paul to talk about the CLO modeling project.
Yeah, before digging into that, just a note, I endorse Larry's suggestion. You really should read the 5 pages. It's a very thoughtful piece, and we hope it's going to be influential going forward. CLO modeling, we talked a couple of times about this, but let's dig in a little deeper. Next slide, please. CLOs, they really are the poster child for regulatory or RBC arbitrage. And that's because, of course, the underlying is that rare case of rated instruments. So we've got something where you can actually compare the RBC if you held the underlying directly as opposed to holding it in or through a CLO investment. And that came to a head in May of 2022 when the IAO staff provided a memo asserting that the aggregate RBC charge for holding all tranches of a CLO should be the same as for holding the underlying loan collateral. And to the extent that it was less than that, its conclusion was there was regulatory arbitrage. The IAO memo recommended that NAIC designations to be assigned to CLO investments should be based on SSG modeling that would be designed to eliminate the RBC arbitrage rather than filing exempt and CRP ratings, and they pointed to the precedent of RMBS and CMBS financial model securities that were instituted in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009, 2010. We're not quite sure that it's a legitimate precedent. It's no small matter to note that the reason that RMBS and CMBS are financially modeled was because the reaction of the rating agencies was quite hostile, and the downgrades that the rating agencies put through during the throes of the great financial crisis punished RMBS and CMBS to the point where insurers would have had to hold much larger amounts of RBC. So seeing that significant increase in RBC likely to apply, they reached out to the NAIC and sought relief from the RBC that would have been triggered. So it was an accommodation to industry and a reflection of that. This is not that. This case is where the proposed modeling is expected to produce more capital requirements than the NRSRO ratings would normally imply. It's also important to note that the hypothetical is just that. It was a single B loan portfolio. A lot of CLOs are not single B only portfolios. Some may be, but not all are. And that the presumption is only true where you hold a vertical strip in the same CLO. And in our experience, that's actually a very rare event. U.S. insurers do not hold vertical strips in these broadly syndicated CLOs very often, and even in non-broadly syndicated CLOs very often. So the hypothetical, and that's an important point because towards the end of the program, we're going to be addressing what the principles should be for assigning RBC to ABS. And one of them really questions whether there's actual regulatory arbitrage where you don't hold a vertical interest and you only hold a specific security, or whether, as appears to be the view of the SVO, you should be holding RBC as if you held a vertical strip, even if you don't hold a vertical strip. The second part of the proposal made by the IAO staff was the NAI6 designation would be split from 1 into 3 categories, and they recommended, because it's a function of the capital adequacy task force, that the RBC factors to be assigned to these 2 new categories, 6B and 6C, would be 75 and 100% on the theory that the equity charge had to be upped to eliminate the regulatory arbitrage. Next slide, please. So after months of deliberation, the Valuation Securities Task Force actually agreed, at least with the first part of the SVO's proposal, and they amended the PNP manual in February to make CLO investments a financially modeled security like RMBS and CMBS. Parenthetically, I would note the proposed amendments were put forward as necessary for the NAIC budgeting process. And it was always acknowledged that if the P&P manual had to be amended, that it would be amended, and that the amendments that were approved in February 2023 were only those required to allow the NAIC budgeting to go forward. The change obviously has no effect until there's a methodology for the financial modeling that has to be in place. And there's been an ad hoc group led by the SSG and including industry representatives, as well as the American Academy of Actuaries, more from them later. And they're all working on developing the appropriate methodology with a self-set aspirational goal of having it all figured out and in place by 2024. I think it would be fair to say there's significant controversy about even some of the basic assumptions. There's expected to be much more controversy about the coming scenario analysis that has to be agreed in the methodology. But there's a process underway. Again, the goal is to have that in place by 2024, and that would trigger, obviously, the P&P manual that would result in the withdrawal of filing exemption for CLO investments and the requirement that all CLO investments be modeled. Just to highlight, I think it's probably evident, but to highlight, the residual tranches of CLOs are not affected by this proposal. The modeling would only be required for the rated debt portion. The residual tranche of CLOs is to be addressed separately under, as Larry has described, the RBC IRE working groups work on RBC for ABS. Next slide, please. And in fact, that leads me to turn it to Larry, who's going to talk about that. Larry.
Thanks, Paul. Next slide, please. So the focus on residuals. I mentioned earlier that the RBC IRE working group has a very broad mandate to look at RBC treatment of all ABS, but they initially focused on the residual tranches of ABS. They have also requested and received the American Academy of Actuaries counsel in their endeavor. But the residual tranches first bubbled up to the surface as needing attention. And initially, the membership of the working group and the industry was divided on the question of whether the 30% equity charge on residual tranches of ABS was too low and needed to be boosted in the near term, or whether any changes could be deferred for better data, more thorough analysis taken up as part of the broader project. There really were two camps. The Take the Time to Get It Right camp said that there should be thorough analysis before major changes are made. It wasn't clear whether there was enough investment in these tranches by insurance companies for it to constitute a material risk to solvency, that there wasn't a consensus definition on what even constitutes regulatory arbitrage, as Paul mentioned, and that making changes too quickly could have unintended consequences. But there was also the something has to be done now camp that said the current treatment of 30% is too low. It's not reflecting the tail risk. This is a bigger issue than some people realize, and it might be very big for certain individual insurance companies. It has to be addressed now, and let's not wait. So in the end, next slide, please. There was a decision in June that was a compromise approach. Actually, one of the states came up with this to try to unify both sides around a common proposal that could be unanimously approved. And that is that for the 2023 RBC calculation, the base factor for residual interest stays at 30%, but a sensitivity factor has been added of 15%. And what that sensitivity factor is, in my layman's language, not being an accountant, is it's a kind of pro forma addition to the base factor. So the insurance company calculates its RBC ratio based on the 30%, and then also add in now the sensitivity factor and say, what would it be if it was 45%, just so regulators can look at that figure as well and give it the weight that they think appropriate. But for the 2024 calculation, the base factor will go up to 45% with no sensitivity factor. And then the footnote is that if representatives of industry or actuaries or other interested parties can present additional information before June 30th, 2024, then the working group could consider modifying this increase to a 45% factor before the year-end 2024 RBC calculation. So that's still out there as a possibility, but folks are now looking at that at that 45%. Next slide, please. So now that we know that residuals are getting whacked, what is a residual? And next slide, please. We'll talk about that for a bit. And this is a good time for me to mention, we're not spending a lot of time in this session. We have in some of our prior webinars on the Statutory Accounting Principles Working Group and its principles-based bond definition. As Paul mentioned at the beginning, that was adopted by the SAPWIG at the August 13th meeting. It is to have an effective date of January 1st, 2025. That's been more than 3 years in the making. And I think most folks are pretty pleased with the way it has developed and think that it's a reasonable approach to deciding what is and is not a bond, and involves revising the two main SAPs, 26R on bonds and 43R, that's going to be renamed asset-backed securities, as well as some other SAPs, notably 21R, other admitted assets, which is where an investment that is a debt obligation but doesn't satisfy the new principle-based definition of bond will be classified. And our prior presentation in this reverse inquiry series has a lot of details about that, and this is a link here if you'd like to learn more about it and don't already have that background. Next slide, please. But what the SAPWIG did going forward was to expose for comment, relatively short comment period ending September 12th, revisions to some of the SAPs and the annual statement instructions for Schedule BA to clarify what is in scope of a residual tranche and how does the residual tranche get reported in the investment schedules of the statutory statements. And why such a short exposure period? Because of the desire to have this effective on December 31st for the annual statements. And that is pretty important now that residuals are getting this higher RBC charge, first on a pro forma sensitivity factor basis, and then in another year on a permanent basis. So as I put it in a somewhat flippant way, given that the residuals are getting whacked, we want to know what a residual is so we know who gets whacked. Next slide, please. The proposed definition, and I'll spend some time on this because of the importance of the treatment of residuals. A residual interest or residual security tranche, and they collectively use the term residuals for all of that, exists in an investment structure that issues one or more classes of debt securities for the primary purpose of raising debt capital backed by collateral assets. So the focus is on securitizations. And the primary source of debt repayment is through the cash flows from the underlying pool of collateral. And they mentioned that these designs could be backed directly or indirectly through a feeder fund. So feeder funds are definitely going to be in scope of the residual. The lowest priority interest in a feeder fund will fall within that definition. So the collateral assets generate the cash flows from which interest and principal payments are derived with a waterfall. And once those waterfall requirements are met, whatever's left over from the cash flows coming out of the collateral assets or ultimately the sale of the collateral assets, that's what the residual interest holder gets. It's kind of securitization 101 here, but let's go on to the next slide. So the concern obviously is that when an asset doesn't perform in the collateral pool, doesn't perform as expected, the first hit goes to the residual holders. And this is the so-called tail risk or cliff effect, as it's sometimes called. You could have, depending on how the tranches are set up, you could have a 10% shortfall in the collateral pool, and potentially, depending on the size of the residual interest, 50%, maybe even 100% hit to the residual interest. And that it was the rationale that those who were really ringing the bell for a higher charge were focusing on. And the other thing that is mentioned in this proposed definition is that you look at substance rather than legal form. So whether this residual tranche is in the form of a note, or whether it's in the form of equity, or whether it's debt or equity for tax purposes, those kind of considerations would not be in and of themselves determinative. You would look at the substance of it and whether it fits within this definition as those who only receive payments when the higher tranches have received their contractual entitlements. Next slide, please. Some of the examples that they gave, and I was glad that they gave examples, and this is not an exhaustive list. Once again, they keep saying you have to look at the substance, but some of the characteristics of examples are that residuals often don't have a contractual principal interest, that they may have terms that appear to be stated principal interest, but if there's no default when they don't get those payments, that would be an indication of a residual. They don't have credit ratings or therefore no NAIC assigned designations. They're first loss positions. I mean, I don't have to read every one of these. Those of you can see them, but they may provide payment throughout the investment duration. And they not necessarily are only paid at maturity. They could be paid during the life of the investment. But the point is that the amount of the payment is determined by the residual amount after debt tranche holders have received their contracted principal interest. And sometimes there are triggers that would divert cash flows from the residual holders to the debt tranches under stress of the structure. Next slide. Prior industry comments leading up to this meeting went another step farther and wanted to suggest some examples of what would not be a residual. And interestingly, the exposed draft from the Statutory Accounting Principles Working Group did not embed these examples of what would not be residuals, which leads a little bit of question as to whether does the working group agree those wouldn't be residuals, or is that just someone's opinion? But I think these are useful to think about because there were questions that had come up about whether private funds that issue debt for liquidity or operating purposes, a fund with a liquidity facility, does that make the limited partnership interest now residuals because they've got debt that's senior to them? And at least in the eyes of the interested party, that would not be a residual, which is a pretty important conclusion because there is a lot of use, as we know, of credit facilities in connection with investment partnerships with funds. And I think I agree with that based on the definition that I was just walking through. Because it is not a situation of tranches with serviced by cash flows from the collateral. But this is one to watch. Real estate funds, which are issuer credit obligations in the principles-based bond definition, would not be residuals. Registered funds, non-US registered funds would not be. 40 Act registered funds, BDCs, and any kind of operating entity or holding company that is providing an issuer credit obligation should not be residuals. Next slide, please. Now back to Paul to talk about the RBC Investment Risk and Evaluation Working Group, which is our final topic for today.
Thanks, Larry. RBC IRE Working Group met on August 13. That meeting was mostly a presentation from the Academy, in which the Academy offered its suggestion of a flow chart, which would help guide when RBC should be reset or recalibrated for either a particular investment or a class of investments. And they secondarily proposed a set of principles, which they hope the RBC IRE Working Group will be able to agree with and adopt to guide them again in their overall mission, which is to recalibrate RBC for asset-backed securities. Here again, we commend the slides that were presented to you. They are thoughtful and well worth reading. Next slide, please. Steve Smith, who chairs the Academy C1 Working Group, was the presenter. He outlined the proposal, the flowcharts, again, which are in the material. The two of them, one is when an asset class needs to be modeled, and then when securities within an asset class need to be modeled individually. Something like Occam's razor was offered that you should use the simpler way you can. And accordingly, if there is an existing factor, then you should use that, and you should only model in individual securities as a last resort. They did acknowledge that when you got to the point in the flowchart where an asset class required modeling, the Academy suggested their principles-based approach would apply, and that would be the guide for the derivation of the C1 factors which are required. And they obviously overarchingly suggested that this principles-based approach would provide flexibility, but still provide some certainty and expectation comfort about what was going on. Next slide, please. The principles were 7. They're restated here. I think it's worth actually, I would commend the slides to you again. The presentation goes into more detail of these, but touching on just a couple of them. The point of RBC was really originally and remains being able to help identify weakly capitalized insurers who are at risk and who are posing a solvency problem potentially. Accordingly, flowing from that, small inaccuracies in RBC really shouldn't justify a great deal of work and effort to recalibrate RBC. You shouldn't be acting on RBC unless there's some systemic issue which you're trying to address, is certainly the first principle, at least as I would state it. The arbitrage should really be an issue only where you have underlying collateral that has its own asset-specific C1 requirement. Think CLOs. CLOs really do present the best case for regulatory arbitrage arguments because, again, the underlying is rated independently and on its own before the CLO. That's not true for most other ABS, so it's unclear, at least I suspect, in the minds of the Academy, whether there's any arbitrage question at all in the case of ABS more generally, again, other than CLOs, where you've got the special case. They posit that the intention or motivation behind structuring should have no bearing on C1 requirements. It's always hard to find motivation anyway, and even if you didn't intend something, a structure could still have adverse C1 consequences. So they think you should ignore motivation, even though it's emotionally appealing to use terms like regulatory arbitrage as justification for actions. They certainly, this one I expect will be more controversial. They propose that C1 requirements on ABS really should look at collateral as it is a dynamic pool, including trading activity. And this I think they have in mind, particularly for things like CLOs, where there is an acknowledged active trading feature and function, and that you should be allowed to use historical data and historical performance to help guide what the real risk of the investment is or is not. And then they do acknowledge that C1 requirements should be calibrated for different risk measures where appropriate. That I think is an acknowledgement that some of the CTE that's used for the regular bond factor RBC charges really doesn't apply terribly well to ABS. Next slide, please. I think importantly too, the presentation made by the Academy grapples with the meaning of regulatory or RBC arbitrage, and they note that it being the basis for a number of the initiatives which we've discussed today. The Academy, or Mr. Smith, noted that the SVO seems to exhibit a pretty broad definition for RBC arbitrage, and I mentioned that you've got RBC arbitrage even if you hold just an individual tranche, even though you only actual arbitrage if you hold the vertical strip and you don't hold the vertical strip. And he clearly drew a distinction between that broad view and a more narrow view, which is RBC arbitrage is really only happening where you've got the vertical slice being held. And he did note that he thought it was a necessary precondition for everyone to agree on what type of RBC arbitrage we're talking about before we could really discuss its implications for setting new RBC requirements. Next slide, please. Next steps for the RBC IRE, they continue to work on their general mission of calibrating ABS RBC. They really haven't indicated whether they agree with the principles that the Academy offered at the meeting. We certainly, however, hope that they take them seriously. I would note that they did invite the Academy to make the presentation and to come up with these constructs, and they have reached out previously to the Academy for support on these matters. I would note, however, that the support they reached out for when they were talking about CLO modeling was largely ignored. The Academy had come back when asked about CLOs and said, not a systemic problem. Oh, and if you want to model them, you've got to do a ton of work. And it doesn't seem particularly obvious to us that there's a big enough solvency issue here that you should be doing the work. That was blown off and blown by. but we do hope the Academy's recommendations and their proposed principles and flowchart are taken seriously. However, we're just going to have to wait and see. That, I think, concludes our presentation. I see we have just a couple of minutes. Let me see if we've got some questions we could respond to.
We do have some questions. I think we can deal with those pretty quickly.
Okay.
The easiest one is, will the slides be shared? And the answer is yes. You'll receive an email after the program that will include a link to the slides. There were two about the, I'll respond to. One is, will the CLOs be modeled by a third party like CMBS are modeled by BlackRock and RMBS are modeled by PIMCO? So far, it does not appear that they will. It looks like the Structured Securities Group within the NAIC Investment Analysis Office will be doing that itself. That was a point that was raised very early on when the modeling proposal came up. One of the members of the task force said, this seems like a pretty heavy lift. That's a direct quote. And do you think that you have the staff for that? And the answer was, we will have whatever resources we need. So that's the current plan. It could change. A question was, can a junior mezz tranche that is rated sub-investment grade be designated as residual if the NAIC deems the equity, the true denominated residual, to be too small? That's an excellent question. I think the answer is potentially yes. And those examples of residuals that the slide had earlier, one of them was that residuals may be structured with terms that appear to be stated principal or interest, but lack substance and result in receiving the residual cash flows. So there is a recharacterization risk potentially if that most junior slice is too thin, and then someone could say that the one above it is really in a residual position, is also in a residual position. So the definition would allow for that possibility. The other question, maybe Paul, you want to talk about this on the momentum or motivation. Was it just embarrassment about the collapse of the global bankers, insurers, or is the overarching concern over private equity entry into life insurance and asset management also feeding in to the proposal?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'll just express my own personal view. There's a subtext to some of this, which does pit private equity owned and affiliated insurers against more traditional insurers. I think you can quickly get, to the point where you ascribe more importance to that than perhaps is actually reflected. But it certainly was evident, for example, on the RBC IRE working group deliberations about what the residual charge should be. The two camps that were split really did reflect largely private equity owned and affiliate group, and the other group being the more traditional life insurers. And then I note we've just had another question come in. I think that most of the material we've been describing is actually applicable to life companies. I think some of them are applicable to PNC, but some are not yet, although there are statements made that they will become applicable to PNC companies when there's a process that will allow that to happen. But I have in mind the residual stuff, I think at this point is exclusively life and fraternal insurers, Larry, and we need something else to happen before those requirements apply to PNC companies.
That's correct, although the chair of the Capital Adequacy Task Force has said that's coming down the pike.
Right, and then we got a couple more. This question asks about operational liquidity leverage for funds. He anticipated a point I was going to make, he or she. I think a leveraged credit fund really poses a really interesting case. I don't know whether a leveraged credit fund is, an operating type leverage, or in fact, it makes the equity that you would have held or that you hold in the fund a residual or not. I think that is, for people who are familiar with the bank capital rules, that's an extensively addressed issue in the bank capital rules. There are, 8 factors that indicate you're an operating type company, and there are 6 factors that indicate you're an investment fund with limited investment discretion, and you're more like a securitization, and so you're ABS. I think we're going to explore that. I hope we explore that in more detail, because I do think that's not answered by the current proposal. And I do think industry is likely to be quite engaged on that question. Leveraged credit funds exist, and you need to know whether your investment is a residual or not, particularly with a 45% capital charge coming down the pipe. And I would note that in conjunction with the known application of 45, we are expecting industry to really galvanize and figure out where there are asset classes which don't warrant a 45% charge. We saw a couple of the insurers raise that in comments already. And again, I think that if there's enough interest, they certainly could quite easily put together packages of data that really would suggest you shouldn't be applying 45% against everything. And again, this is a personal view. This clearly does illustrate the problem of taking RBC action in the absence of real data and analysis. There is nothing that suggests 45 is the right number for anything. We know 30% may not have been the right number for ABS because it was derived from corporate bond data, but there's nothing supporting 45%. It was a compromise, raw and straight up. And so we really do expect industry to start focusing on that before sooner rather than later. I think that's all the questions we have time for. I see we're slightly over the appointed hour. Just a personal note, if I may, I have resigned from the firm as of June 30. I've taken senior counsel status for some limited transitional matters, but I do want to take this, which is probably my last webinar, as an opportunity to thank Larry Hamilton, who has been incredibly generous with his time and his experience and skill set in helping me understand the matters which we've talked about today and other matters affecting the NAIC and the insurance industry. Larry's been a terrific colleague and partner in the truest sense of that word, and I want to thank him publicly. And while I'm gone, you're going to be in good hands. Art Rublin, Mike Gaffney, and others at Mayor Brown will be picking up what I was doing and be involved in these matters going forward. So we hope you continue to feel comfortable reaching out to us for these questions, because we enjoyed engaging with you on these difficult matters. That concludes our presentation today. Again, we're going to be sending out an email with the presentation slides and a link to the recording. We thank you all for your time and attention.